Hello, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's a very special evening, and we are looking forward to a talk with David Swanson. He's the executive director and co-founder of World Beyond War, .org, who will be talking about guided missiles, misguided policies, and changing directions. This talk has been organized by Peace and Justice Works and the Iraq Affinity Group. Peace and Justice Works has on local, national, and international levels for nearly 30 years in Portland, and this includes Portland Cop Watch, a group that has been drawing connections between militarism and policing locally and nationally. And that whole time, the Peace and Justice Works Iraq Affinity Group has been educating the public about efforts about the effects of U.S. policy and other areas, including South and the domestic costs of war as well. This evening's talk has been sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace Portland, Albany Peace Seekers, and the Veterans for Peace Linus Pauling Chapter 132, Corvallis. And you can see all of those fine groups right there. We thank them for their support this evening. The evening's also been endorsed by the Olympia Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Earthlings Arts-Based Environmental Education, and the Pacific Green Party of Oregon. Again, these evenings take a collective effort, and we thank you. We'll have time for questions and answers after David's talk this evening. That'll be about 8:30 tonight, and you'll have the opportunity to send in your questions. You can do that at feedback@pjw.info. That email address displayed on your screen. If you have questions tonight during the talk, you don't have to wait till the end. You can email those questions anytime to feedback@pjw.info. And we'll have that information for you again at the end of the talk. But go ahead and feel free to email anytime with your questions. And then following the questions and answer session, we'll actually be having a little after event Zoom call, a little after party for the participants and cast and crew of this evening. And we'll have the connection information for that coming up at the beginning of the questions and answers. Again, we're excited that you're with us this evening. This is such an important talk, right? We are talking about issues of war and peace, the costs of war. And without further ado, I'm excited to introduce the renowned activist, author, and peacemaker, David Swanson. As I mentioned earlier, David is the executive director and co-founder of worldbeyondwar.org. He is an author, an activist, a journalist, radio host at Talk Nation Radio, and a campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. His books include War is a Lie and War is Never Just. He blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org. David is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and he was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. David Swanson, thank you so much for your work, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for having me. Let me know if you can't hear me or see me properly, and I will do what I can. It seems like you've got a terrific coalition together here and a terrific system for these events. I've lengthened the title of these prepared remarks to, here's the full title, Guided Missiles, Misguided Policies, and Changing Direction, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love World War III. So I'll speak and then hopefully spend a good deal of time on Q&A. I'd like us to start by considering this question. If it's true that madness is more common in societies than in individuals, and if the society we live in is aggressively hastening, as I think is well established, climate collapse, I hear it's a little bit warm with most of you right now, ecosystem devastation, wealth inequality, and institutional corruption. In other words, processes that are clearly counter to conscious stated desires. Is this society perhaps no exception to the rule? Is it perhaps insane? And are there perhaps other interconnected madnesses that we don't see entirely clearly precisely because we are members of this society? What about locking huge numbers of people in cages at an expense much greater than giving them good lives? What about devoting land, energy, and resources to feeding animals to feed people using food that could have fed 10 times as many people without the environmental destruction and animal cruelty? What about employing armed and trained killers to tell people they are driving too fast or shouldn't bicycle on the sidewalk? Could it be that lots of stuff a saner culture would call loony looks as normal to us as burning witches, bleeding patients, and exhibiting eugenically awesome infants looked to others in the past? In particular, what if it's just not permanently and universally normal and rational to be taking all the steps being taken to hasten nuclear apocalypse? We've got scientists saying the catastrophe is more likely now than ever, and that the nature of it would be worse than ever previously understood. We've got historians saying the near misses are more numerous than ever before known. And yet, we've got media outlets informing everyone that the problem vanished 30 years ago. We've got a US government dumping vast treasure into building more nuclear weapons, refusing to forswear using them first, and talking about them as usable. One of the key reasons for the danger having supposedly passed is that the number of times the existing stockpiles of nukes could eliminate all life on Earth has been reduced, if you can dignify that with the term reason. Much of the world is clamoring for the elimination of nukes, while another chunk of the world is defending their manufacture, distribution, and routine threats of using them. Clearly, somebody is right and somebody is crazy. By somebody, I mean a whole society, not its individuals, and despite all the exceptions. What about the whole idea of killing people? Killing prisoners to teach them not to kill people, killing people who look from the perspective of a distant video camera like they might be an adult male in the wrong place and near a cell phone suspected of belonging to someone unliked, plus any men, women, and children who happen to be nearby. Killing people who cross a border and run from armed fighters. Killing people who get in the way of police and look like their skin has a bit too much pigment. What if the whole practice of killing all of these people has something wrong with it? What if it's as deranged as the doctors who bled George Washington to death, or Phil Collins' belief that he died at the Alamo, or Joe Biden's idea that the US government doesn't interfere in other nations' elections? What if killing people is certifiably bonkers, even in an imaginary scenario in which the United Nations has authorized a good humanitarian war and the people being killed are all wearing uniforms and nobody's tortured or raped or looted and every murder is super respectful and free of hatred or animosity? What if the problem is the careful avoidance of peace that gets each war started, not the details of the atrocities? What if the phrase war crimes, as a phrase to say a lot in public so nobody thinks you're a fascist or a Republican, is actually as nonsensical as slavery crimes or mass rape crimes, because war is a crime in its entirety? What if every war for decades has actually killed disproportionately the so-called wrong people, the elderly, the very young, the civilian? What if there's nothing worse than war that can be used to justify war? What if wars are principally generated by wars and by preparations for wars? If this were true, and I'm willing to debate every claim that it isn't, would there not be something a little bit shy of playing with a full deck to be found in the practice of investing trillions of dollars in the machinery of war? The case made on The World Beyond War website is, of course, that the diversion of money into war preparations that make people less safe, not more safe, itself kills vastly more people than have been killed in all the wars thus far. It does this by depriving us of those things we could have spent the money on, things like food, water, medicine, shelter, clothing, etc. If this is true, and if it's additionally the case that war fuels hatred and bigotry and racism, that war and preparations for it devastate the natural earth, that war is the one and only excuse for government secrecy, that the war bases and weapons sales and free training and funding prop up horribly oppressive governments, that the war business erodes civil liberties in the name of some mysterious substance called freedom, and that war coarsens a culture while militarizing police and mines. If all of this is true, the offense of war that those infected by the madness call, quote, the defense industry, might just be the most cuckoo confabulation ever concocted. This much I have said a billion times, and 1,000,000,005 times I've replied to the World War II delusion that you will all very likely ask about as soon as I shut my mouth. No, World War II did not have anything to do with saving anyone from any death camp. The US and Allied governments explicitly refused to accept the Jews out of Germany, and for openly anti-Semitic reasons. No steps were ever taken to halt the murders of the camps. The war killed several times what the camps did. The war came about after years of Western arms race with Japan and support for Nazi Germany. US corporations critically supported the Nazis right through the war for profit reasons and ideological ones. The Nordic race nonsense and the segregation laws and much of the extermination inspiration and technology came from the United States. The nuclear bombs were not needed for anything, and if it were needed for and nothing about World War II proves that violence is needed for anything. And if it were needed for opposing Nazism, hiring lots of top Nazis into the US military wouldn't have made much sense. See my book, Leaving World War II Behind, for the longer version. Now I want to say something even crazier. Or if I'm right, I want to say quite sanely that something is even crazier than war. I have in mind the advancement of the risk of World War III, of the first war waged directly between big rich countries since World War II, a war likely to involve nuclear apocalypse. I don't think most of the people moving the world toward World War III think of themselves as doing that, but I don't think even the CEO of ExxonMobil thinks of himself as advancing the cause of climate collapse either. If the US president wanted to start World War III and be aware of doing so, he would simply launch the nukes. But here's what I really want us to think about. If a society wanted to start World War III without being aware of doing so, what would it do? I know Freud took a lot of flack for saying people had some mysterious death wish, even though they would deny it. But I think at this point, the burden of proof is on those who would try to prove him wrong. Because I don't think an effort to accidentally start World War III and blame it on somebody or something else would look particularly different from what US society is doing right now. The US military has plans for war on China and talks about a war on China as being perhaps a few years off. They call it a war with China, of course, and can count on Congress members to saturate us with the idea that China has aggressively threatened US prestige by growing wealthier, or aggressively moved into the waters just off the coast of China. But the fact is that despite major increases in its military spending, as the US has moved bases, troops, missiles, and ships, including what the US Navy ridiculously calls the Big Stick Carrier Strike Group, near China, China still spends about 14% of what the US and its allies and weapons customers spend on militarism each year. Russia is at about 8% of just US military spending and falling. If there were a credible enemy for the US military on this planet, you would be hearing a lot less about UFOs right now. We also hear about Chinese violations of human rights, but bombs don't actually improve human rights. And if human rights violations justified bombs, then the US would have to bomb itself and most of its dearest allies, as well as China. And how do you threaten war against someone for how they manufacture products that you buy? So maybe making sense isn't the goal. Maybe war is the goal. If you wanted to bring World War III closer, what would you have to do? One step would be to make war normal and unquestionable. Go ahead and check that one off. Done. Accomplished. Flags and pledges to them are ubiquitous. Thank yous for a supposed service are everywhere. Military advertisements and paid for pre-game ceremonies are so omnipresent that if the military forgets to pay for one, people will create one for free. The ACLU is arguing that young women should be added to young men in being forced to register for a draft, to be compelled against their will to go to war as a matter of civil liberties, the civil liberty to be completely stripped of all liberty. When President Joe Biden went off to meet with President Vladimir Putin, both major political parties in the United States generally encouraged hostility. The Hill newspaper sent out an email with a video of the movie Rocky, demanding that Biden be Rocky in the ring with Putin. When, despite everything, Biden and Putin behaved almost civilly and issued a tiny little statement suggesting they might possibly pursue some unspecified disarmament, and Biden stopped calling Putin a soulless killer, the two presidents then held a pair of separate press conferences. There were no Russian media questions allowed at Biden's, but US media brought the craziness to both. They hurled nutty accusations. They demanded red lines. They wanted a commitment to war as a response to so-called cyber war. They wanted declarations of distrust and enmity. They wanted self-righteous revenge for the supposed stealing of the 2016 election and enslavement of President Donald Trump. They would have appeared, I am convinced, to a disinterested observer from one of the UFOs they're always going on about, to have wanted World War III. The US military and NATO have indeed said that war can be a response to cyber war. At Putin's press conference, he discussed various actual laws existing and potential. Russia and China and other nations have long sought treaties to ban weaponizing space and to ban cyber war. At Biden's press conference, I don't think a single law was mentioned once by anyone. Yet the constant theme was imposing a rule-based order on others in the name of stability. Nothing boosts instability more than replacing the very idea of written laws with arbitrary decrees from might makes right officials who believe in their own goodness. Believe it so much that they announce, as Biden did, that were the US government to interfere in anyone else's elections and were the world to find out about it, the whole international order would crumble. We know of 85 foreign elections the United States has blatantly interfered in during the past 75 years, not to mention assassination attempts on over 50 foreign leaders. And we know that in poll after poll, the world says it fears the US government above all others as a threat to peace and democracy. Yet the international order does not collapse because it does not exist, not as a set of moral standards based on respect. If you wanted to move the world closer to World War III without realizing you were doing it, you could convince yourself that you were simply imposing a Pax Americana for the world's own good, whether the world liked it or not. Even while knowing in some back corner of your mind that sooner or later, the world would not stand for it, and that when that moment came, some Americans would die, and that when those Americans died, the US media and public would scream for blood and vengeance, as if the past many millennia had taught them nothing, and boom, you'd have what you never even knew you wanted, just like you have the day after browsing Amazon.com. But how to make sure to get those Americans killed? Well, nobody else has ever done this, but one idea would be to station them, and here's a real stroke of genius, with their families along, on bases all over the world. The bases would prop up and control some horrible governments in raging local populations. The bases would cause environmental damage as well as plagues of drunkenness, rape, and lawless privilege. They'd be sort of giant gated apartheid communities that the locals could enter to work menial jobs if they got out by sundown. Maybe 800 of these bases in 80 nations or so ought to do the trick. They would, strictly speaking, not be justifiable in terms of unavoidable future wars, given what can be moved where, how quickly now by airplane. But they might just make future wars unavoidable. So check that off the list, done, and almost unnoticed. Okay, what else? Well, you can't very well have a war against enemies without weapons, can you? The United States is now the leading weapons supplier to the world, to the rich countries, to the poor countries, to the so-called democracies, to the dictatorships, to the oppressive royal despots, and to most of its own designated enemies. The US government allows weapons sales and or gives free money with which to buy weapons and or provides training for 48 out of 50 of the most oppressive governments in the world, according to a ranking funded by the US government, plus plenty of nasty governments left out of that ranking. So when you hear that the guys who chopped up a Washington Post reporter for Saudi Arabia were trained in the United States, this is not an exception to the rule. This is the rule. Few, if any, wars happen without US weapons. Most wars today happen in places that manufacture few, if any, weapons. Few, if any, wars happen in the handful of countries that manufacture most of the weapons. You may think China is coming to get you. Your Congress member almost certainly thinks China is keenly focused on eliminating his or her right to send free mail and appear on television at will. But the US government funds and arms China and invests in a bioweapons lab in China, whatever may or may not have come out of it. The weapons dealers do not imagine, of course, that they are bringing on World War III. They're just doing business. And it's been gospel in Western madness for centuries that business causes peace. Those who work for weapons dealers mostly don't think they're causing war or peace. They just think they're serving the US flag and the so-called service members. They do this by pretending that most of the weapons companies' customers do not exist, that their only customer is the US military. All right, so the weapons bit is well covered. What else is needed? Well, if you wanted to roll a society into World War III over a period of years or decades, you'd need to avoid the vicissitudes of elections or popular mood swings. You'd want to increase corruption to the point that shifting power from one big political party to another didn't change anything terribly important. People could have a bit of emergency funding or a new holiday. The rhetoric could vary dramatically. But let's say you gave the White House and the Congress to the Democrats in 2020, for example. What would have to happen for the death train to remain on the tracks? Well, you'd want no actual wars to end. Nothing makes wars more likely than other wars. With both houses having voted repeatedly in the previous Congress to end the war on Yemen, vetoed by Trump, you'd need those votes to cease immediately. You'd want Biden to pretend to sort of partially end the war on Yemen and Congress to go mute. Same with Afghanistan. Keep the forces there and on surrounding bases quietly and make sure Congress does nothing in the way of actually forbidding the continuation of the war. In fact, it would be ideal to block Congress from ever lifting its grubby little paws again, as it pretended to do on Yemen when it could count on Trump vetoes. Perhaps it could be permitted to repeal the AUMF, or Authorization for the Use of Military Force, from 2002, but keep the 2001 one around just in case it was ever needed. Or perhaps that one could be replaced with a new one. Or the Senator Tim Kaine scam could be allowed to advance a bit, perhaps. This is where Congress itself repeals the War Powers Resolution that specifies how it can prevent wars. and replaces it with a requirement that presidents consult with Congress before feeling free to ignore Congress. The trick is to market this abandonment of the War Powers Resolution as a strengthening of the War Powers Resolution. Okay, that should work. What else? Well, boost military spending beyond Trump levels. That's key. And invite the so-called progressive members of the United States Congress to lots of meetings. Maybe even give them a few rides on presidential airplanes. Threaten a few of them with primaries if needed. Whatever's needed to keep them from actually trying to block military spending. 5 of them in the House could block anything the Republicans oppose, but 100 of them putting out a public letter pretending to oppose what they facilitate will do no harm at all. Okay, that's easy. What else? Well, avoid peace with Iran. What good would that do? Just stall and prevaricate until we're past the Iranian elections and they've got a new super hostile government, and then blame the Iranians for that. It's never failed before. Why would it fail now? And keep funding and arming the attacks of Israel on Palestine. Keep Russiagate going, or at least don't renounce it, even if the journalists start appearing rather than just being crazy. A small price to pay. And nobody likes the media anyway, no matter how much they obey it. What else? Well, a major tool that has increasingly proven its worth is sanctions. The US government is brutally sanctioning numerous populations around the globe, fueling suffering, animosity, and bellicosity, and almost nobody knows it. Or they think of it as law enforcement rather than law violation. It's brilliant. The US government can even impose sanctions, cause suffering, blame the suffering on the local government's efforts to alleviate the suffering, and propose a coup as a solution straight from the rule-based order. We rule, so we give the orders. Also, we'd better be sure to keep the climate catastrophe on track, and for a number of reasons. First, if the nuclear apocalypse never comes, the climate one will. Second, the climate disasters can be used to fuel international crises that, with enough prodding and arming, can lead to wars. Third, the military can actually be marketed as a climate protector because, although it's a major contributor to climate change, it can announce how concerned it is and use natural disasters to excuse invasions and establish new bases. And nothing builds up war spirit better than refugees, no matter who caused the horrors that they are fleeing. Even disease pandemics can help advance the cause, as long as a reasonable and cooperative response to them is avoided. We'll want to balance blaming China with avoiding blaming bioweapons labs or their international partners and investors. The US government can completely control through the media what possible explanations for the origin of a pandemic are acceptable and which ones are deemed, ironically enough, crazy. What we'll want to avoid is questioning the priority of maintaining labs that can create new tools for wars, and proposing any global solutions to pandemics that might foster cooperation or understanding rather than profit and division. Okay, isn't this enough? What else could be needed? Well, you can't very well put World War III straight onto the stage unrehearsed, can you? We'll want to have some full dress rehearsals, major ones, the sort that could accidentally morph into the real thing, the biggest ones ever in Europe and in the Pacific. And more missiles in places near Russia and China, and more nations invited into NATO, especially some of those right on the border of Russia that Russia says it would never sit still for. War in Ukraine may be a bit too obvious. How about a coup in Belarus, perhaps? What you want is to risk World War III without jumping straight in with both feet. After all, the other guys need to start it. Let's think, how did the US get into World War II? Well, there was the Atlantic Charter. Let's make a new one. Check. There was sanctioning and threatening Japan. Make that China. Check. There was supporting Nazis in Germany. Okay, make that Ukraine. Check. There were big new bases and ships and planes and troops in the Pacific. Check. History doesn't repeat exactly, but there are many opportunities. Drone murders and bases and so-called anti-terror operations across Africa and Asia. coups and destabilizations in Latin America, plenty of hotspots, plenty of weapons, plenty of propaganda, cyber wars anywhere at any time, and who can say who started them for sure? War is getting easier and easier. So let's ask a different question. What would US society look like if it wanted to avoid World War III? Well, it would drop the exceptionalist shtick and join the world. Stop being the biggest holdout on human rights treaties. Stop being the biggest vetoer at the UN. Stop being the biggest opponent of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Start supporting the rule of law instead of the rule-based order. Start supporting democracy at the United Nations instead of as a word you say in speeches. And prioritize cooperating in global efforts to address environmental and health issues. In a United States intent on avoiding World War III, you would see masses of people demanding the money be moved from militarism to human and environmental needs. You'd see opposition to militarism across the population, as well as from movements that are directly impacted by militarism and generally pretend they aren't, such as environmentalism, anti-poverty, immigrants' rights, civil liberties, and transparent government movements. You'd see moves to demilitarize, close foreign bases, close domestic bases, divest funding from weapons, convert war industries to peaceful and sustainable industries. You'd see people who appeared on television and were right about upcoming wars allowed to appear on television again, rather than being banished to blogs and the bottom dregs of Facebook algorithms. You'd see lying about wars treated as something other than the top qualification to lie about more wars. You'd see a lot more basic, straightforward reporting on wars, including what's called the humanizing of people. I confess I have never understood what people supposedly are prior to getting humanized, but it seems they're decidedly not humans. Take, for example, a 7-year-old boy in Yemen who tells his mother that he wants to go to school. His name is Shakir, and he speaks with a bit of difficulty caused by funny teeth and a bad habit. But that's not why his mother doesn't want him to go to school. She's afraid of missiles. She teaches Shakir at home. He sits at a little wooden desk next to the dining table, and he pretends to be at school. His mother loves him and finds him adorable and enjoys having him there, although she gets tired, needs a break, and knows that school would be better. But then the buzzing grows louder. Shakir crawls under his desk. He smiles, he tries to think it's funny, but the buzzing gets even louder. It's straight overhead. Shakir starts to cry. His mother gets down on her knees and goes to him. When Shakir is finally able to get some words out, he says, "It's not safer here than at school. It's not safer here than at school, Mommy." The drone passes over. They're still there. They've not been obliterated. The next day, Shakir's mother allows him to board a bus to school. The bus is struck by a US-supplied missile via the Saudi military and US targeting. Shakir's mother buries part of one of his arms, which is found in a tree. Now he's humanized. Now they're all humans. But they're all humans, always. The victims are all always humans. Though if the media won't humanize them, people will deny it to themselves. In a society bent on avoiding war, the humanizing would be relentless. And when it wasn't, protests would demand it. Of course, there is a wide gap between driving hard toward World War III and proceeding to abolish all militaries. Of course, it can only be done by stages. But when the stages are not understood as steps away from apocalypse and in the direction of sanity, they tend not to work very well, even to backfire. War has been so reformed and perfected that people imagine guided missiles killing only and exactly those who really needed killing. We can't survive much more reforming of war. The United States could radically scale back its militarism, destroy all of its nuclear weapons, close all of its foreign bases, and you would see a reverse arms race among other nations as a primary result. The United States could simply stop selling weapons to others and see militarism rolled back significantly. The United States could withdraw from NATO and NATO would vanish. It could stop badgering other nations to buy more weapons, and they'd buy fewer weapons. Each step toward a world beyond war would make such a world appear more reasonable to more people. So that's what we're working on at World Beyond War. We're doing education and activism to build a culture of peace and to advance demilitarization around the globe, including through divestment of funding from weapons and through efforts to close bases. We're also working to align more movements and organizations against war by making the connections across divisions, such as by pressuring the conference scheduled for November in Scotland to stop excluding militarism from climate agreements, and working to demilitarize domestic police forces in places like Portland. I'm not sure we shouldn't be also developing alliances with mental health workers, because either war is crazy or I am. And I ask only that you take your time in deciding which it is. Thank you.
And thank you so much, David. This is that time that you can go ahead and email us your questions for David. If you have something to say, you're wanting to understand a point a little bit deeper, please go ahead and email us feedback@pjw.info. And we will be happy to take your questions and take them straight to David so we can continue the discussion this evening. Again, this evening has been organized and brought to you by Peace and Justice Works and the Peace and Justice Works Iraq Affinity Group. The Iraq Affinity Group has been educating the public about the effects of U.S. policy on the people of Iraq and other areas of the world, including Southwest Asia, North Africa, the Middle East, as well as the domestic costs of war. And also, it has been co-sponsored by Jewish Voices for Peace Portland, the Albany Peace Seekers, and Veterans for Peace Linus Pauling Chapter 132 Corvallis. Please do support the work of Portland Peace and Justice Works. You can do that by sending your donations to Peace and Justice Works, P.O. Box 42456, Portland, Oregon 97242. You can also donate online. You can just go to the Peace and Justice Works website, pjw.info. That full URL is pjwdonate.html. But if you don't have a pen handy at the moment, just remember PJW for Peace and Justice Works, Peace and Justice Works, pjw.info, and you can find how to donate on that website. Please do contribute. The work is so very important as we build coalition and try again to continue building a peace movement. And you can be a part of that by organized efforts, supporting these groups that have been sponsors, co-sponsors, endorsers this evening, and of course, by financially supporting Peace and Justice Works. After the Q&A session, we will be doing a little after party via Zoom, and we invite you to connect with us there. That meeting ID number is on your screen. I could start reading off all these numbers, and I contemplated doing that, but my years of hosting radio and not make sense. So there is on your screen meeting ID number. I will give it out for the visually impaired. The meeting ID, if you have the Zoom client on board, then you just enter the meeting ID number 812-2451-8124. And the passcode that you enter at that time will be 591728. To call in to that Zoom meeting without the visual component. But if you just want to call in, you can join the call at 253 215 8782. There is a much longer web address. You can see that on your screen. If you cannot, please do email feedback@pjw.info, and I can email you that information back. That is just too long to read on screen. So with that, as we are waiting for people to send in their questions, I want to actually, I'm going to go ahead and read our first question of this evening, sent in by somebody other than me. The U.S. just blocked access to Iranian media, Press TV, and to VenezuelanAnalysis.org. Do you see this as some sort of precursor to war?
Well, that remains to be seen, but it certainly is part and parcel of the same attitude and approach and movement that includes war and is making war more and more likely with both of those countries. It's, absolutely outrageous that it's somehow deemed acceptable, not even major news, not a particularly significant concern, that the United States government can take over the websites of media outlets that are based in foreign countries and just eliminate them. You can imagine if the Iranian government or the Venezuelan government took over MSNBC or CNN or Fox and shut down their website, what the outrage would be. And it's this double standard that it's somehow law enforcement to be a lawless, renegade criminal member of world society. This is what we have to undo, and this is deeper than support for war or belief in the justifiability of war. I mean, this is much deeper. The belief in U.S. exceptionalism, the notion that the U.S. is different and superior and has more rights and rules are for lesser entities. This is so deeply ingrained, I want to say, in almost all of us in the United States. And I wrote a book about this topic a couple of years ago on curing exceptionalism, meant as a guide to how to cure yourself of exceptionalism, because I think it is so deeply in all of us. But the sanctions, the vicious sanctions, the refusal to engage in any potentially effective way in restoring that agreement with Iran, the attempts to overthrow the government in Venezuela. I mean, these are all steps that can lead to war. And it's not clear that they can lead to anything else other than war or a complete reversal of approach by the U.S. government. I mean, they certainly will never lead to their stated intended purposes, namely getting the Iranians and the Venezuelans to voluntarily install U.S. friendly puppet governments. This is not going to happen. These are people who, and also today you had the U.S. and Israel, I think, again, stand alone or as a pair of outlaws against ending the encircling of the blockading of Cuba. And this has been going on for my entire lifetime, and it has never remotely begun to hint at having the intended result. The intended result is simply not intended. This is just vicious sadism against a socialist government, and it's very risky, and it's lawless and it's criminal, and people who do such things and go around talking about imposing the rule-based order on the lawless world, are the biggest hypocrites we've got going.
I have a question around accountability. I appreciate your statement that war crime is a bit redundant, to say the least. And yet we have an international system to attempt to bring war criminals to justice. Yet somehow or another, the US slips through, and we don't actually seem to be able to be held accountable. Can you speak to that, and how can we change that? How can, in fact, we end that sort of US exceptionalism and actually have accountability for people that make these decisions that end up with these horrendous actions?
Well, I think one of the more likely ways to get to that is from governments other than the US government and people other than the US people finding the courage to stand up for the rule of law and hold the US government to it. You know, for a global organization like World Beyond War, we work as a global community of peace activists, and we put some of our focus on other governments around the world, because you can prosecute under universal jurisdiction. You can demand that the International Criminal Court be an international criminal court, not an international criminal court for Africans. You can strengthen the rule of law, but you know, the current system is that the Kellogg-Briand Pact is completely ignored. Various regional treaties that forbid war among their members, and there are some that include such members as the United States and Iran, both, are completely ignored. And the United Nations Charter is virtually ignored, and the little loopholes that it has in it for acceptable wars that are defensive or UN authorized are virtually never, you know, those loopholes cover virtually no wars that we've seen in recent decades, but there's always this imaginary sort of notion that somehow US wars must be justified somehow under the UN Charter. And so I think we need education and we need activism. And we need education around the fact that war is illegal. And my God, if you get people prosecuted for some particular atrocities during war and held accountable, and it reduces those atrocities, I don't care how you talk about it. You can talk your own made up language for all I care. I'm not going to quibble over the words. I just want to make the point that, you know, talk of war crimes is sort of the extreme that's allowed in US discourse. And it serves to shut out any talk of the fact that war itself is a crime. And this is including through the International Criminal Court, which is now, in theory, though it hasn't done it, set up to prosecute the crime of war, or what it calls the crime of aggression, you know, maintaining this fantasy, at least linguistically, that there is, you know, defensive war and aggressive war, and it's only the aggressive war that we must punish. And so, you know, if you had democracy in the United Nations, if you had every country but two voting for something carrying the day, or you had even a glimmer of outrage over that, the way you do when the minority rules in the US Senate. If we ought to have majority rule in the US Senate, why the hell shouldn't we have majority rule in the United Nations? If you had that, you know, then you would have prosecutions of wars. The trouble is the United Nations, unlike the League of Nations, which the US wouldn't join because it would have been one among equals, the United Nations is set up with an uneven playing field where 5 of the biggest war makers and weapons dealers are more equal than others and get to veto and, you know, prevent without even having to veto anything they want. And so it's not just that the members are nations, the war makers, rather than representatives of people. They are you know, the worst of the nations in terms of ridding the world of the scourge of war, which is what the UN was created to do, supposedly, are given the special power to derail everything. Just, you know, the US, Russia, China, England, France, these are the Joe Manchins and Kristen Sinemas of the United Nations. They can block anything they want, regardless of, you know, moral reasoning.
And I want to remind people that if you have a question tonight for David Swanson, please do email us feedback@pjw.info. Feedback@pjw.info. David, the next question is, can you talk a little bit more about the World Beyond War and partner efforts to end killer drones? How do we, and not only to end killer drones, but also to change the language we use? I think a lot of times when we hear about drone strikes in any kind of media, if we hear about them at all, there's still this impression left that they are surgical, that they are clean, that they only hit their targets, and maybe, most sadly, and a civilian now and again. But as your story about humanizing people it told us just a few minutes ago, that's not really the case, right? So can you talk a little bit more about drones, changing that public perception of them, and your efforts to stop them?
Well, a lot of great activists and journalists and people around the world and groups around the world and around the United States have done great work for years on this topic. And a petition that's been going for years, you can find at banweaponizeddrones.org and sign it and promote it. World Beyond War has done webinars and events on this topic. Some friends and allies of ours have recently created a new organization that you can find at bankillerdrones.org, which is starting an effort on the model of the new treaty banning nuclear weapons, or the treaty banning landmines, to create a treaty banning armed drones and surveillance drones as well. And they are putting together, these friends of ours are just putting together a petition that will be launched very soon. I think at diy.rootsaction.org. Another place I work is rootsaction.org, and there's a do-it-yourself petition site, diy.rootsaction.org. And this is going to be a petition to end all airstrikes on Afghanistan. We're supposedly ending a war that's mostly an air war without committing to ending the air war. And so this means strikes from drones or missiles from the ground or from ships, but not from drones, all airstrikes. I think drones are a very interesting phenomenon for educating people and moving people because once you find out what they actually are, they look a lot more like murder even than a nuclear bomb. Is there a small enough scale for people to comprehend? But the mythology about what drones are is even more off track than the general mythology about war. I mean, people generally imagine war resembling war of 150 years ago, with battlefields and fronts and ground forces and uniforms and maybe tanks. But they don't understand war as it is today, as war on villages and cities, and there's no front, there's no battlefield, and drones, it's even worse. People imagine this law enforcement mechanism where somebody has been put on trial and convicted, and they're the worst of the worst, and they're somehow magically unreachable, yet you can identify exactly where they are, and they are in the act about to momentarily slaughter vastly more people than you're going to kill by blowing them up along with whoever's nearby. And so you just have no choice. It's the only moral option. You must send your surgical strike in to commit capital punishment at a distance against this evil lawbreaker. This is sort of encapsulated in this Hollywood film Eye in the Sky, where they invent this scenario, which I asked the director to his face whether any bit of it resembled the truth in any way, and he admitted that it didn't. Where they identify the person by name, almost never happens. Where the person is about to commit a crime and they can prevent it. No known case of this actually happening. Where the person is unreachable, can't be arrested in the ordinary way and put on trial. countless cases where we know for a fact that could have been done but wasn't desired. It's the vast majority of the people killed with these drone strikes are not identified, that nobody knows who they are. So you can't make these pronouncements about how they are the worst of the worst who really needed to be killed. Nobody even claims to know who they are. And if they're not, if they're anything other than an adult male, then you have to give a few sentences to explaining who they were. Otherwise, they are just to be killed. And it's made war even easier, and it's made reckless actions that cause wars even easier, and it's made murder even more normal. Police murders in the U.S. for how much they are still outrageous to us, and capital punishment in the U.S., which now is going to have firing squads in more states, is so outrageous to some of us. But it's things like a foreign policy of supposedly picking people out and murdering them with missiles that normalizes murder in people's minds. It's just horrific for our culture, for the rule of law, for international relations, and for avoiding war.
Well, and normalizing murder and normalizing war, certainly, having now been involved in the longest war, in our history, there are people who are, young adults who really don't remember a time when we were not at war. And that does something, to our psyche, I think, as a nation, not to mention all of the vets that have been through this horrific system, who are also, then abandoned by the government, basically. I want to bring up another question sent in, which is about education. And the question as written is how to separate education from government companies. But if I could sort of get to the crux of that, it's about how to really get real education, even early education going, that would be separate, I believe, from that U.S. exceptionalist propaganda that which we are always taught in our history classes, right?
Yes, indeed. I want to just respectfully quibble with the longest war thing, because I think that if Native Americans were really understood as real, honest to God human beings, people would stop saying that. I mean, I know everybody means absolutely 1,000% well when they say it. But I mean, if you read David Vine's latest book, United States of War, there has not been a moment when the United States wasn't at war, and the colonies before it was the United States. And some of the particular wars with particular nations, honest to God nations of honest to God human beings that were the natives of this continent whose land was stolen, went on for decades, went on for 3, 4, 5 times the length of this war on Afghanistan. Now you can stretch out how long the war on Afghanistan's actually been going back to the 70s if you want, but even still is not remotely the longest yet. But it is still as horrific as you can imagine. And even though the U.S. Veterans casualties and those who've suffered are a teeny tiny fraction of the human beings who've suffered in the recent wars, the report just a couple days ago from Costs of War Project at Brown University found that 7,000 U.S. Military members had died in combat and 30,000 from suicide, right? And female U.S. Military members have suffered, I am absolutely convinced, vastly more injury and trauma and even death from male U.S. military members than from foreign military members. How do we educate a different world? I mean, when we find particular books and courses and films, we put them on our resource pages on the World Beyond War website. There are wonderful children's books teenagers' books, fiction and nonfiction, you know, making our schools better, public schools or private schools, is a, you know, is a big project that takes organizing and activism. But there are great organizations with great resources to use to find the courses that should be taught and the books that should be taught. And we try, in the particular area of peace, we try to promote the best of those that we can find, as well as to do endless online courses that people of every age group take part in.
And there are wonderful organizations of progressive teachers who are, again, trying to build that agenda, and it's wonderful to support them. And I do appreciate what you have said about calling the latest 20-year, 21-year incursion, 20-year incursion in Afghanistan the longest war. I absolutely appreciate your feedback on that. Thank you. I want to, the next question here coming in is, many Americans hold on tightly to the myth of our country's history, and it's too emotionally threatening for them to accept the truth. How can we reach them? How can we get through that emotional resistance? And I think this also gets into that American exceptionalism. Everything you've been taught is a lie. How can we get through people's automatic defenses to that?
Well, there's the knock them down and then help them up approach, and there's the gently nudge them over the next year and a half approach, and I think both can be right depending on the person. And I think, you know, so when I write books and articles, I tend more often to take the slap them across the face and see what happens approach, but this is, you know, broadcast to who knows who. And with some people it works and with some people it doesn't. When you're talking with an individual, I mean, the important thing is to let them do more of the talking than you. Find out exactly what it is that's troubling them and try to help them through it. You know, I mean, I read a terrific book this week called Forget the Alamo, and I wrote a review of it that pretty well, you know, demolishes the myths around what happened at the Alamo. And I got hate emails, you know, but I also got thanks for opening my eyes emails. And I think, you know, if email is a wonderful medium for people to be hateful and imagine they're not really reaching a real human being, you know, but if you can talk with someone, even on Zoom or face to face about it, you can ask them and be respectful and say, now, I know I might have something wrong. Tell me what you think happened at the Alamo, and try to correct them bit by bit. And, you know, there are also extremes in the analysis of this, right? There are the people who say, oh, well, facts never persuade a human being, only basic emotions, and you should just set aside facts and reason and not bother with that nonsense. And then the opposite extreme. And the truth is actually indisputably in the middle. Facts and reasoning sometimes move some people, and passionate, visceral appeals to emotion sometimes move some people, and we should try both, you know. But I go and I talk to high school classes, college classes, even on Zoom, about abolishing all war, and I ask them at the beginning of the hour, raise your hand if you think war is sometimes justified, and almost every hand, and at the end, and almost no hands or no hands, and I've just provided basic information that anybody could have provided that they never heard before.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're able to put things in plain talk for people, I think we can do a lot. And again, to humanize, when we aren't to each other, know how that happens. I think the media has a lot to do with it. I think relation from some others have a lot to do with it. But the more we can do to, in fact, make the world human, to get each other to understand that and love of life. And that, trying to reach across and do that one-on-one thing I have found a session, which is, can you talk about how we can reduce the military's impact on climate? We know the military is one of the largest, if not the largest polluters. Can you talk about that connection and how we can impact that?
Yeah, I can try. You were breaking up a little bit, so if I missed something important, let me know. But I think people can go to worldbeyondwar.org/environment and see what we take to be the most important top facts about military and environment, and then the resources and the secondary facts and the films and the videos and the books. We've tried to make a website that is this sort of a resource, and the fact is that militaries and war preparations are major contributors to all kinds of environmental destruction of land and water and air, including of climate. The US military, famously the top single consumer of petroleum on Earth. And, during wars, a ridiculous amount of the petroleum consumption is used in transporting petroleum fuels to the wars. And it would be laughable if it weren't so destructive. And it's given a pass. It's given an exception in Kyoto, in Paris, in the UN meetings. It's in every agreement. Countries are left free to leave military greenhouse gas emissions out of their reporting on, and they're acting to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So a number of coalitions all over the world and groups all over the world are working on plans to try to push the next big UN climate meeting to end this practice, to include militaries. There's no reason why you shouldn't include militaries in greenhouse gas emissions limitations. So this is a meeting that starts in Glasgow in Scotland on November 1st. And we haven't really promoted it yet, but I can tell you early, we're just putting together a coalition at a website with a petition that is at cop26.info. That's COP26 numerals 2 and 6.info. That's the name of the meeting, COP26, the 26th UN climate something meeting. We haven't got it working with the HTTPS yet. So if you fail to find that website, take the darn S out of the HTTP. But cop26.info, we're asking organizations to sign on to that and partner with us, and individuals to sign it. And I think it's something we can organize and promote and educate around from now through November.
And for folks that are listening and watching at home, by all means, if you have a question, you can still get in and ask that question now. You can email that to feedback@pjw.info. That's feedback@pjw.info. We have something close to about 20 minutes or so left here in the Q&A session with David Swanson. So you'll want to go ahead and email me very quickly to get your question in. When I was having a quick online conversation about this, somebody posted a comment as a challenge saying that, if the world was truly to end war, it would be a huge disaster. It would tank all these economies. We just wouldn't have any idea what to do with ourselves. We're not ready for that. The world is just organized, in this way, and that our economy requires it. And beyond the immediate response of, this is a disaster, I'm willing to work us through. How do we start to transition our economy from a war-based, carceral-based economy to an economy that supports life, that supports our infrastructure, education, housing, healthcare, and all the good things? How do we do that?
Yeah, there's this incredibly widespread but demonstrably false belief that military spending, for whatever harm it may do, maybe it'll get us all killed, maybe it's slaughtering innocent children, but at least it's a jobs program. At least it creates jobs, and it's very hard to dissuade people that this is bullshit, because their wife works for a contractor and their neighbor works for a subcontractor and their uncle's in the Navy, and they imagine that these are real people with real jobs, as of course they are. But there's no dispute among the economists that if you took those same dollars and spent them on education or green energy or even dirty energy or infrastructure, or even what Joe Biden calls infrastructure, or even never taxed those dollars from working people in the first place, you would have more jobs and better impact on the economy in its same own terms. And so military spending eliminates jobs. As if this jobs program thing could somehow justify it in the mind of anyone other than a sociopath. It isn't true. It's factually false. And it's also worth understanding that the weapons industry and the military industries, enormous as they are not the only thing manufactured in the United States, are not 90% of our economy, and there's nothing left because everything else is made in China. It simply isn't true. There is, in comparison to the weapons industry, there is a lot of other industrial manufacturing still happening, despite all the outsourcing and automating and so forth. And so it's absolutely necessary that we move first out of the mindset that imagines that our lifestyle is dependent on bringing war and hell to other people far away, as if that would be okay if it were true. And then moving our government and our economy out of war industries into peaceful industries. And there's no, as with addressing climate change, we've known what could be done for decades. We've just failed to do it. Creating conversion to peaceful industries is not some sort of mystery, some sort of, need for new research into a new field of science. We've known how to do it for decades. We've just failed to do it. During this disease pandemic, there's this shipping company in Bath, Maine, that is often protested by wonderful peace activists. And the federal government called up and said, hey, we need you to work with a couple of small companies, because we think that together you'd be able to manufacture these devices that we need to address this disease pandemic. And I mean, within hours, you had companies that will never work together. It'll be too complicated working together. You had workers and machines that could never be, retooled and retrained to work on something else, working instantly. All you needed to do was do this on a bigger scale. All you needed to do was take this entire company that's making warships and have them make something useful for the world. And there was nothing visible that would prevent scaling it up. So it not only can be done, it is done. It's just not done on the scale that we need. And the legislation to do it, out of Seymour Melman's books, back when I was an infant and before, the conversion bill that died with Kennedy, the conversion bill that was killed with the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, the conversion bills that are introduced still. And you could do it with a Green New Deal if even the Green New Dealers weren't terrified of peace. You could do a demilitarized Green New Deal that would actually fund a big chunk of the Green New Deal, as well as undoing one of the industries that's worst for the environment, the militarism.
Right on.
And
Thank you for that
sorry,
answer.
Ani, I could add that the divestment campaigns that World
Weapon
Beyond War is doing
have
and others are doing take money out of the weapons industries. And if you're really good, put money into local projects that are good for local communities. And if you go to worldbeyondwar.org/divest, you see where we've done it and how to do it and how to get us to help you do it. And it's very educational. It gives people something that's relatively easy to succeed at, and you move on from there.
next question is it seems like the peace movement has been in decline for the last decade or so. Can you talk about factors in this historic decline and what it will take to bring it back, and the decline specifically to the US? What will it take to reinvigorate the peace movement?
Well, I think the decline is always appears more than it is in reality, because it's a question of what's on TV and what's in the newspapers. I remember when the Occupy movement was still going strong, but it had stopped being talked about or shown on TV or in the newspapers, and you had people physically at Occupy events with other people talking about how they weren't there and it didn't exist anymore, because what's on TV is more real than what's real. The peace movement has never gone away. There have been thousands of people doing heroic, courageous, brilliant things day after day after day. And of course, in the United States, the ebbs and flows of the peace movement are different from the rest of the world, where you have success stories all the time of preventing bases and stopping wars and blocking weapons shipments. And so it's for success dependent people, it's helpful to work globally, because you'll get those stories from outside the heart of the empire. But of course, people who go back to remember where the peace movement was in 2003, 4, 5, and understand that it put a new Congress in Washington, D.C. in 2006, with every exit poll saying the top reason was to end the war on Iraq, and gave the Democrats the majority in both houses. Then they immediately said, we're going to escalate the war on Iraq so we can run against it again in 2008. That was demoralizing for people who were especially paying attention and noticing things. And for people who weren't, those same Democrats who were still telling everybody how to think were telling them to shut down the stupid activism and put all their money and energy into electing a Democrat to the throne in 2008. And of course they did that, and there was a Nobel Peace Prize and all was sweetness and joy in the world, except that the wars rolled on and the drone murders became a whole new thing, and the military spending and the development of the nukes and the bases in Africa and the shift to Asia and all the hell we're still dealing with rolled forward. And so, my advice then as now was, first and foremost, stop identifying with a political party and start identifying with your principles. And if somebody in any political party does something right, encourage them and cheer the hell for them. But if they do something wrong, oppose it, no matter which team they're on. I mean, there was a couple professors, Michael Heaney was one of them, who put out a book called Party in the Streets, that just you saw them at every peace event for years. They were surveying everybody. How'd you get here? Why are you here? How'd you hear about it? What are you doing next? What do you think? And their analysis, principally the peace movement grew in 02, 03, 04 because people thought the Democratic Party wanted peace, and shriveled away in 2007, 8, 9 because people thought the Democratic Party didn't want peace anymore. Well, if you identify and get your family and friends to identify with peace and let the Democratic Party come to us when it's willing to be for peace, that would be a huge step against, not the only, but the primary, the number one cause of the decline you're thinking about.
Okay, we have one last question. And this person wants you to just maybe explain a little bit more about how other countries could demand the U.S. change policies and actually rejoin the world. What does international pressure on the U.S. look like?
Well, there's a lot of international pressure from the U.S. There's all of the sanctions, which do not have to be abided by other countries. Other countries can start trading with Cuba and ignoring the U.S. blockade. There is the integration of the U.S. military with others' militaries, the money, the weapons, the training that can be ended. There are the US bases that more often than not are bitterly resented by the people in a country who are not going to protest the closure of those bases. But the governments accept them. The government of Japan could answer the demands of the people and the government of Okinawa and say, okay, yes, we respect your wishes and the US needs to get its bases out. There are countries that could join the Kellogg-Briand Pact that never have, that could join the International Criminal Court that haven't yet, that could insist, I mean, Russia doesn't have to take the bait and do its own war rehearsals across the border from the US ones. It could appeal to the world to demand the rule of law and insist on prosecutions, if not at the International Court, through what's called universal jurisdiction, where a country's court system simply finds the courage to prosecute under international law crimes committed elsewhere that are not being prosecuted. This should happen. Whether countries should boycott, sanction, divest from the United States, I'm so against boycotts, divestments, and sanctions in general, principally as horrible tools used by the United States, that I'm not so sure. But breaking free of, why illegally allow the United States to keep nuclear weapons in your country against the vicious opposition of your people, the majority of your people, as 5 countries do. Nations need to step outside of the US empire and stop playing along and stop being part of it. If you were to see 1 or 2 countries do that in a significant way, it might have a snowball effect.
Indeed. That would be pretty inspirational globally, I would think. David, I want to thank you and let folks know, if you did not find out about this event this evening with David Swanson by an email from Peace and Justice Works, then you're probably not on their email list. You can change that by emailing the Peace and Justice Works office. pjw.info/iraq.html is a website. And of course, their email address, iraq@pjw.info. So you can make sure that you are on the mailing list for the Iraq Affinity Group and be in the know when other events like this happen. Also, you can get more information about World Beyond War and make sure you're on their newsletter list by email, by going to their website, worldbeyondwar.org. Again, this evening was made possible by Peace and Justice Works Iraq Affinity Group. And I'm going to ask one more time for contributions to go to the Peace and Justice Works and Peace and Justice Works Iraq Affinity Group. And that address again is P.O. Box 42456, Portland, Oregon 97242. You can contribute online by going to the website pjw.info/pjwdonate.html. I want to thank our co-sponsors again this evening. That would be, my paper, that would be Jewish Voice for Peace, Portland, Albany Peace Seekers, and Veterans for Peace, Linus Pauling, Chapter 132, Corvallis. Thanks to all those groups for co-sponsoring. And of course, this is that time for that Zoom after party. If you would like to join us in just a couple moments, if you have more questions or just want a chance to informally chat, you can join us. The Zoom Connect is, if you have the Zoom client, 812-2451-8124. That passcode is 591728. If you want to call in, that number is 253 215 8782. And we hope that you do join us momentarily as we get back together after this event and just have a chance to chat for a moment. David, do you have any closing remarks this evening?
I don't think so. Lots of great questions, and thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Absolutely wonderful evening. Thank you so much, David, for being with us tonight. It's great to hear you speak. It's wonderful to just hear somebody talking sense about war and why its time has come. We need to end it and get on with actually making a world better for all of us. Thank you so much, David, for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us this evening. And we hope to see you again in the Zoom after party. And if not there, then please do join us as Peace and Justice Works continues to arrange really meaningful events like this to keep the movement together and informed. Thanks very much for joining.